Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. My name is Jennifer Andrew. I'm the Communications Director at Public Schools First NC. I'm joined by our Director, Dr. Von Brannon, and our guests tonight are attorneys Mark Dorosin and Elizabeth Haddix. Elizabeth will be joining us a little bit later, but just wanted to thank everyone for showing up. I know it's a busy week, but this is a really, really important subject, especially going into the fall. So thanks for tuning in. First, we're going to hear from Mark. Mark is one of the managing attorneys at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law Regional Office. He led the UNC Center for Civil Rights until the UNC Board of Governors banned it from engaging in legal advocacy. While at UNC, Mark helped develop the Inclusion Project, which focused on the continuing impacts of racial segregation and exclusion in housing, environmental justice, political participation, and education. Elizabeth, who is joining us later, is also one of the managing attorneys with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law Regional Office. Previously, she was senior staff attorney at the UNC Center for Civil Rights, where she expanded the focus of the center's community-based advocacy and led the center's innovative environmental justice program. Elizabeth grew up in Mississippi, earned her BA from Duke, and taught public high school in Eastern North Carolina before earning a JD from the UNC School of Law. And now we're going to hear a little bit of the background and history of the Leandro case. And during this broadcast, if you would please put your questions in the chat, I will be monitoring it and we'll address them later. Thanks again for tuning in.
And as you can see, I'm hoping everybody can hear me, but as you can see, my internet just wants to flake in and out. This is because my son says I won't get the real internet, but that's not true. But I am happy that you're here tonight. Really and truly, when people hear about the Leandro case, sometimes they're amazed. And the Leandro case really is at the heart of what we care about in North Carolina. North Carolina has really been fortunate in that we truly, literally have a state constitution that says that we are to provide a sound basic education for all children. And so the whole case around this issue, the Leandro case, began when a lot of parents and educators and community members said that's just absolutely not what's happening. The state is not fulfilling its obligation. And so public school advocates have been pushing legislators to meet this obligation for literally decades. And so we want to just talk a little bit about the history of this case. And I don't want to read every single outline here, but I've invited Mark, who has been involved in this case from the very beginning, probably one of the most involved people in this case. In that 1994 Leandro versus State, some parents and some students and some school districts, primarily in low wealth rural communities, filed a lawsuit. And this lawsuit was basically about, hey, we're not seeing that in our county that we're getting the same sound basic education that we see in other counties, particularly more high wealth or urban counties in our state. The case did rule in their favor, and it did really basically say it's inequitable, it's inadequate. The school funding across the state is not being distributed fairly. There are a lot of problems with the funding, especially for children of color and those from families with low income. So the North Carolina Supreme Court did allow this case to move forward in 1992, and in 2002, the court found that there was a violation of the students' rights to a sound basic education and ordered the state to do a remedy for this. So since this time, and you can think about that, it's 2020 now. So what's been going on, it took us 8 years to get to 2002, okay? And now here we are, and 18 years more later, you know, what's been going on in terms of complying with this ruling. So in 2017, a few years ago, the plaintiffs, including the intervener and the Charlotte-Mecklenburg branch of the NAACP, jointly asked the state to appoint somebody independent. someone outside of the system on either side to come in and give expert consulting to help the state figure out how they were going to align to deal with this case. Mark, I want you to jump in anytime you want to and add any meat to this.
Yeah,
A
I'd be
lot
happy
of people
to.
don't understand it.
Yeah, so I'd be happy to. I mean, we had a big jump there from 2002 to 2017. It's worth just
Yeah,
noting a little bit about the history of the case, just so people understand part of why it's taking so long. So the case was filed in 94, as you said, Yvonne, and then the state's argument initially was that that language in the Constitution, in our state Constitution, that guaranteed the right to education, the state argument was that all that meant was that there had to be a school for you to go to. It didn't have anything to do with the quality of the education that was offered. They said, yeah, it's in the Constitution, but it really doesn't have any substance. That, and they sought to dismiss the case. That went up to the Supreme Court, and in, as you said, in 1997, what's called Leandro 1, the Supreme Court said the state is wrong, that the right to a constitutional right to an education does have a qualitative aspect, and it does require that students get a sound basic education, and it described what that meant. Basic reading and writing and mathematical skills, the ability to know history and social studies and things like that, and to be able to meaningfully participate as a resident in our community. So then the case went back to Wake County. There was a trial. The trial was in, as you said, in 2002, the trial court ruled that, in fact, the state is not providing a sound basic education, that it was not meeting its constitutional obligation, that the state was violating the constitutional rights of these plaintiffs, the students and families and these low-wealth school districts. That decision went up to the Supreme Court a second time. And in 2004, the Supreme Court again ruled against the state and said, upheld what the trial court had found, that the state was liable. So if you think of, in a civil case, the defendant is found liable. It's like the equivalent of being found guilty in a criminal case. So they said, the Supreme Court said that the Wake County court decision was right. The state is liable. It's not providing a sound basic education, and you've got to come up with a remedy to do that. And so from 2004 till now, what we've all been arguing about, the plaintiff school districts, the clients that we represent from Charlotte, and the state, is what is the remedy? How is the state going to actually be held accountable, and what is it going to do to make sure that all students have the opportunity for a sound basic education? And so from 2004 till 2017, there were a series of annual or biannual hearings where Judge Manning in Wake County would call all the parties in, and he would get the test scores, at the end of the year, and he would look at them and he would say how so many students were still not, we're not passing EOGs and EOCs and graduation rates. And he would hold a 2 or 3 day hearing and go through all this data and ask the state what it was going to do. And the state would say, well, we're going to try this, or we're doing this, or we're doing that. But nothing was making any changes. But all during that period, the court never issued another order or ordered the state to do something. Then in 2017, Judge Manning retired. A new judge was appointed, Judge David Leaf. He's from Union County. And with the new judge, at first the state Board of Ed tried to have the whole case dismissed. That was the first thing that happened. Said it was so long since the trial, so long since anything had happened that it didn't make any sense to keep going. We, the plaintiff interveners that we represent, the plaintiffs, fought that very hard, and Judge Lee denied that motion. He said no. The state has still not remedied the constitutional harm. Now, at that time, 13 years later, a whole cycle of students from kindergarten to 12th grade had gone through an unconstitutional educational system. And so at that point, we, as Yvonne said, we made a joint motion for the state to the court to hire an expert consultant to really look at that we can no longer rely on the state or the State Board of Ed to come back and say what they were going to do or explain how they were making this progress. That what we really needed was an independent assessment of where we are, whether the state is fulfilling its obligations, and if it isn't, what needs to get done to do that. So this organization called WestEd, as is noted on this slide, a nonpartisan, nonprofit research, educational research organization working with groups in North Carolina, like the Friday Center out of at NC State. They spent a year, over a year, doing the research, studying the issue, and they had focus groups with a range of stakeholders. They conducted independent research. They looked at all the testing data. They worked with the State Board of Ed. In 2019, they completed and submitted to the court their report, the WestEd report. And it's a powerful report. If you are interested in education advocacy and you are working on trying to ensure students have a meaningful opportunity for education, I urge you to get a copy of the WestEd report. It's available online. I'm sure Public Schools First has a link to it. It's a comprehensive and powerful document. And what it found is that, as we expected, that the state has not fulfilled its obligations, and that education was underfunded in North Carolina, and it really broke down what needed to be done into a number of core areas, which I think is one of the slides here. Yeah, so these are I think there are 7 points altogether, and these are some of them. So one is the big picture, which is how do we revise the state funding model to make sure that resources are being distributed efficiently and equitably. And that means across the state. What the report showed, where there are these significant geographic disparities, there are disparities among districts, and we also know that there are disparities within districts, that in some districts the whole district is low wealth and is struggling to provide students with the sound basic education. Other districts have schools. They are higher wealth districts, but they have schools that have concentrated at-risk students, high poverty students that the Leandro court identified as at-risk. So one is to revise the state funding model. 2 is, again, providing a qualified, well-prepared teaching staff, teacher in every classroom, teacher in every school. The 3rd is administration, providing a well-qualified principal in every school. Number 4, provide at-risk students the opportunity to attend high-quality early childhood education programs. Early childhood was a key component of the Leandro cases. The state had made some progress in that, developed some early childhood, more at 4 and NC pre-K, but even those programs aren't meeting the needs. Number 5 is one that the lawyers committee and we have really has been a priority for our clients and really for a lot of the advocates is recognizing the need for additional targeted resources and opportunities for economically disadvantaged students. And we know, and Public Schools First has done a lot of good work on things like the school report cards and how what they really reflect are levels of poverty in schools rather than students' growth or other measures of learning. So one of the focuses that WestEd noted, and again, the Leandro opinion noted, was that even though the state was failing to provide a sound basic education overall, it was particularly failing at-risk, what the court described as at-risk students, which meant students from lower economic on free and reduced lunch, students from a single parent household, students that limited English proficiency, all the factors that students are bringing to schools that have them at a disadvantage in being able to take advantage of the educational opportunities that are available. And so it's not enough that what the Wested report noted and what other advocates have known is more resources need to go to meet the needs of those students. Number 6 is to provide the assessment system and the accountability system. And I think there's one more, I can't remember. Again, this regional support for low performing and high poverty schools, and then monitoring. A big issue has been monitoring, is how are parents and families and students and the State Board of Ed and the legislature and the governor to know how we're doing. How are we, once we identify what plans need to be put in place, how are we going to monitor whether those plans are working, whether they're effective, the ones that are to put more resources into, the ones that aren't to jettison and find different alternative remedies. So, and I just really want to emphasize some of the stuff in the Wested report that is so critical, particularly around this question of at-risk students and high poverty schools. What the report recognized is that there have been some policies in place that were designed to address the needs of those students, but they've been resource starved. The report also recognized that there were other needs that, particularly for those students, that were not being met. Things like having sufficient support personnel in schools, nurses, social workers, counselors, programs that could address the out of school impacts on children's learning, everything from healthcare, mental health, adequate food programs, as well as support for families. And so those are issues that our clients have really been prioritizing. And I think, and we'll talk more about this, I hope, at the end, with COVID, what we know, the impacts of this pandemic is that it doesn't impact everybody the same way, right? We have this disparity in our education system. Well, COVID didn't just freeze that disparity in time. What it's doing is it's widening that gap, right? The students who are already at risk are the ones that are going to be the most severely and adversely impacted by the impacts of not being in school, not having access to special ed, not having access to additional resources that are needed. And so all of these issues, which were already critical before we got to the pandemic, now has an even brighter spotlight shown on it by the impacts we're seeing. So, and just a real basic example is, we know in a lot of these rural low-wealth school districts, there's minimal access to the internet, for example. And so the idea of even being able to access online learning, if it's there, is just not realistic for many of these communities.
And Mark, I want to just add one quick comment
please.
there. That what we've seen since March and April, May, June, is that about 20% of our kids have just been disappeared. They have not been connecting because they don't have internet or reliable internet. They're using telephones, cell phones, which don't have the ability to support most of the instruction. They don't have devices, or they don't have a reliable device. And we're not talking about it much right now, because school districts are trying to do their very best. But we spent a big chunk of the spring missing a lot of children throughout our public school system. And that is a tragedy. And now we're starting back again this school year. And again, we still have children who do not have a home right now, who do not have sufficient food. They've lost their housing through to COVID. They've lost their jobs. We've added another layer, I guess I'm trying to say. And we also have a lot of kids, even today, who are still not connected back into the school system. It's a very, very tragic situation. So go ahead, Mark. I didn't mean to interrupt you. So
No, I appreciate that. I hate to be like, the Charlie Brown teacher. Um, um, so, the Wested report comes out becomes public in December of 2019. And, right away, the parties get together, the report is submitted to the court, and based on the original order appointing Wested, Judge Lee said once the report comes out, he wanted something from the parties about what they were going to do, what should be done now that the report is out. And I see my colleague Elizabeth Haddix has joined, which is great to see you, comrade. Um, so in January 2020, the parties put together a consent proposal, which the judge then signed as an order. And that order, did two things. One, it accepted as findings of facts of the court, really all the findings of the Wested report. So the fact that the state has not been meeting its constitutional obligations, that additional resources needed to be provided, and that they needed to address these 7 categories that the Wested report described. And that January order said, I want the state to come back in 60 days with a plan and of how it was going to implement steps, or what steps would be implemented to effectuate the Wested report. And Judge Lee had required that the state come up in consultation with the plaintiffs and with the other parties with a short-term plan, sort of the first year plan, and then a mid-range plan, sort of maybe the next 3 years, and also the final plan, sort of how which Wested proposed, sort of an 8-year full implementation model. And the court order in January said, come back in 60 days with the short-term plan. That was at the end of January. Then, the pandemic strikes in early March, and that deadline gets pushed back. And this slide, I think, does have the 7 components that were in that order. So that deadline gets pushed back with the court's approval, and it gets pushed back a couple of times. The court order in January made it clear that it was the state's responsibility to come up with the plan, right? They were the entity found liable, constitutionally liable, and it was their obligation to develop the plan on how they'd remedy that. And so that got extended. It got extended again, and then in June of this year, the parties came to during this interim, we'd been consulting with each other pursuant to the judge's order, on what the plaintiffs, what our clients, the interveners, thought were the priorities needed to be for this first year, and what the state thought they could accomplish in the first year. And those talks started out a lot more promising because there was a big budget surplus. There's a real commitment from the governor's office and the State Board of Ed to follow through on the Wested report. And then the COVID crisis sort of knocked everything for a loop, timing wise and financially.
It was heartbreaking, really, wasn't it? When I think about the work that Mark, you, Elizabeth, and many of the attorneys who've worked for free or near free for decades on this case, and to have such a remarkable moment of getting this independent consultant do this incredible research and with facts and figures, and then to have the judge put that in a consent order and say, you are the responsible people, state board, General Assembly, you are responsible for this. And you better make sure we have high qualified teachers and a good assessment system and accountability and blah, blah, blah. It was like, were all of you in January just beaming for for at least a week when that consent order came out, and then to see that everything has come to almost a halt. And that's kind of what led us to this conversation tonight, folks wanting to know, some people with us want to know what Leandro is about, and you've done a great job explaining that. And a lot of people want to know, okay, but what is going to happen next? What are there any, legal remedies? What can we do now to move forward?
Well, I mean, and I want to apologize for being late. I had a little bit of a teenage boy crisis here, somewhat related actually to public schools. But, I think it's worth pointing out that one of the greatest accomplishments of, our role, I think, and particularly Mark's leadership, representing the Charlotte and NAACP families in this case is, a couple of years ago when Judge Lee got assigned to the case, his framing this case in sort of the traditional school desegregation model, which allowed or introduced this idea of an expert to advise the court on what compliance with the constitutional mandate looks like. And that Mark really, we took from, I keep saying Mark because it was really, it's the way he conceived of the framing of this case for the court from those school desegregation cases, which were the last significant cases we had in school law that addressed a constitutional guarantee to this right. And so, having WestEd come in and point out this independent education, funding, access expert come in and really go through what was wrong with what the state was doing was extremely important and way overdue, but extremely important. And so, and Judge Lee has been very attentive to the needs identified in that WestEd report and the deficits that have happened as a result of, the state's failure to meet this burden that it has under the state constitution. So that's, we shouldn't lose sight of that win because it's still very much in play right now. And one thing that we are doing, with Mark's leadership on this case for our clients is really just hammer home where this expert to the court, this consultant to the court has identified what needs to happen.
And I think it was really important too that the plan came back with a realistic, 8 years seems incredibly long. At the same time, I think the plan came back with a realistic timeline with money and identified money needed. And it seems like, Mark, I've been to many of those meetings you talked about every year with Judge Manning, year after year, and we would never get up to the edge. We would get pulled down into spirals of talking about this data, this data point, this issue, testing, and we never really got to the point of a plan. And I think it is, you're right, Elizabeth, I hope that in this sad, brief, I hope, pause that we have right now, that people will recognize that we actually have a solid plan with dollars attached and clear action steps that need to be taken. So, you know, the $427 million, which actually ends up being not that much more money each year in the 8-year plan. And looking at how we protect our teacher pipeline, how we're going to deal with at-risk students. And the thing I thought was remarkable and I loved about the report, Elizabeth, was that it started talking about kids when they're 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. Because we, you know, we know that that's where we are really failing. So now the governor filed his plan with the Board of Education. So where are we at now? What are we left with as a community, as educators, as parents, as voters, as citizens? You know, what's the next thing that we can do? What will have to happen next? We're all lost in this legal battle.
Well, one thing I just want to echo Elizabeth's point about the West Ed report and your point, Yvonne, about this that it's a longer term plan. I mean, one thing about this case, about Leandro, when it was decided back in 2004, and even in the first couple of years, there was the state did take some steps to put more money into disadvantaged students, to pre-K. I mean, this case was looked at by education advocates across the country as being a real landmark decision, and sort of looked at as a potential model. And then things got bogged down in the implementation. But in other states, what we've seen is that have similar constitutional provisions, that have had similar litigation. What you see is it is an ongoing process. In some cases, every couple of years, when the legislature puts in the budget, they end up having to go back to the court. The same kinds of hearings we had been having, but without that piece, like you said, Yvonne, without that piece saying, what is the implementation? So I really take to heart Elizabeth's point about what a win that was to get that and to have this roadmap kind of laid out. So we, you know, in June, we did have this plan, this year 1 plan that was submitted, which is also available publicly. It does have this money identified for a range of different programs. You know, on all the 7 categories, support for teachers, increasing racial and ethnic diversity in the teacher workforce, mentoring and support for teachers, more money for the disadvantaged student fund, removing the cap on special ed funding, more money for limited English proficiency learners, a whole range of steps that need to be taken. Now, the big question is, you know, this is a plan that's been agreed to, proposed and agreed to by the state, by the governor's office, the state, and the State Board of Ed. And the question is, how will it get implemented? There's actually going to be a hearing in the next couple of weeks with Judge Lee on this, where he's going to make some decisions about, you know, what he's going to do. We just got information about that today, that there's going to be a hearing in early September. And I think, you know, so one piece will be continuing to monitor what happens in the court case. But the other piece is really the public advocacy that is around this, and that and those two strategies, and you know, Elizabeth and I talk about this in kind of all the work we do, is they go hand in hand, right? There's a lot of great things that can happen through litigation, but it's always limited. And in this case in particular, where there are so many elements of responsibility on the state side, right? You know, the state is the defendant, the state of North Carolina and the State Board of Ed. But there's always a question, well, who's the state? Is that the governor's office? Is that the General Assembly? Is that And all those pieces have to work together. And so that's really where I think, you know, we're kind of pushing that question on both fronts, on the legal front, and then we also need to push it on the, you know, the public accountability front. And in some ways, that piece, I think, and I think probably Elizabeth would agree, that with the COVID crisis, that piece is even more important, right? Because what we know we expect to hear is, well, you know, we don't have any money anymore. You know, all our revenues are lost, and we don't have resources for this. And you know, collectively, the community that demands this accountability, we can't accept that, right? You know, the states had 20 years to be making this remedy, and you know, they made a lot of decisions and put a lot of money away and made a lot of decisions not to adequately fund the kind of resources and programs and needed that WestEd identified. And so it's going to be one of our challenges, I think, is going to be pushing back on this scarcity idea, and that we can't do any of the, we'd like to do all this stuff, but we just can't because of COVID.
And don't you think, I wonder what both of you are thinking about. In some ways, COVID is an easy go-to. On the other hand, when I think about the demands of this case and what it's been saying that we must do, I think it makes it even more imperative, doesn't it? I mean, I look at it as if we already had 25% of our kids living in poverty and 25% of our kids being disadvantaged economically, and all that means, what do we have now? What will we have by January? And so it seems like the need side of the case is growing stronger and deeper and wider. Now, I'm sure, as you said, that doesn't going to stop folks who say there's no money, but there's no money as it's currently structured. That might be true, but do we need to restructure our funding opportunities to meet what is a growing need? One of the things, some of these questions you see on the screen are things that people ask me every day. Well, can the courts force them to comply? So when Judge Lee comes and convenes in September, what will he be trying to accomplish, Mark and Elizabeth? I mean, what is the purpose of the hearing?
Well, we'll find out. I mean, I think the purpose of the hearing is to determine how to take that joint report that was submitted in June and give it the force of the court's order. And whether, I mean, we may find out that there's things that the court believes were left out of that report that need to be put in there. There may be, the court may say, this is a big list, and these things are the top priorities. And if there's going to be any change, we don't know. I mean, I think, I think, and I should say, we think, and Elizabeth, we think Judge Lee is very serious about this case. I think he really wants to see, I think that he wants to see something happen, and that recognizes that this has been going on too long. But he's been, everything he's done has been very thoughtful and very carefully considered. Again, the WestEd, that step was really significant. And I think that, but I think, like all of us, is conscious of the impacts of this pandemic and how that's going to affect, how it's going to affect two things. One is how it's going to affect the resources available, but more importantly, I think, just what you said, Yvonne, and Elizabeth and I, and we've talked about this in these negotiations when we've been talking with the other parties, and everybody acknowledges that this crisis throws into stark relief the disparities that were already existing in our education system. and worsens them. And so, you know, we're not just going to hold steady where we were 6 months ago. We're going to the students that WestEd identifies as the most in need are the ones that are going to be impacted most severely. The schools, the school districts, the students, the families, and so trying to make sure that you know, as COVID enters the conversation about what happens next, to be able to talk about how it's impacts these very issues that the Leandro cases highlighted and the WestEd report highlighted is going to be critical.
I mean, we can learn a lot from you know, sister states that have had similar, you know, challenges under their constitutions and gotten decisions, and you know, are a few years ahead of us on this problem. And you know, this question about monitoring and compliance, how do you force the General Assembly to comply? And, I mean, we have allies in other states that are tackling that now. And what we've learned from them is that there must, you know, we can't rest on our laurels with whatever the court decides. There has to be a grassroots movement among, you know, people demanding accountability from their lawmakers, and that has to happen every single year. Like every session of the legislature, you all have got to be, you know, our clients and you all advocates have got to be on it. And I mean, I think it's a wonderful idea to get in touch with people in, you know, Kansas and New Jersey and Washington and, you know, these different states that are having to deal with it. And Florida. I mean, you know, there's a range. There's states across the geographic spectrum and cultural spectrum that we could hook up with to figure out how to really do this marathon, because it is a marathon. And, you know, you don't change overnight a shift that has been happening for the last 20 years in public education.
So we have a couple of questions. I want to have a few minutes to get you guys asked a couple questions. So the question is, to be clear, that's being asked is the ruling, the hearing that the judge is having to review the governor and the State Board of Education's plan, to review that and give a response to it? Is that what you said the hearing was about?
Yeah, well, yes, there was a plan, you know, the plan was submitted, and we're going to have a hearing where I think the judge is going to ask questions about it, and you know, we'll get more information, and will give the state and the state board feedback on it, and presumably there'll be some order that comes out of that hearing, you know, implementing that plan or endorsing it, or, you know, whatever the court wants to do in that regard.
Okay, another question is, does it look like nothing will be decided until the new 2-year budget is worked on by the General Assembly in January?
Well, that joint plan that we submitted is, you know, was supposed to be for, you know, this year, fiscal 20, you know, they call it fiscal year 2021, but so, and some of the things, if you get a chance to read that plan, the state has indicated some of that money's already there. So presumably some of that stuff will be happening. I mean, again, the question mark of COVID hangs over all of that, but presumably some of those things will be put in place now or over the next 12 months.
Okay, I think the confusion that folks are feeling, and I guess, you know, all of us are, is that school has started. It is almost September. If it's going to be impactful on the 2021 school year, and the money's there, come on, Judge Lee, somebody move forward, right? Take the Mother, may I go 2 steps forward? So that's, I think, some of the confusion that folks are having here. The other question that is people cannot understand is, if the judges ruled and the governor and the state board are okay with it, what is the barrier to the next, to implementing any parts or any pieces of this plan? Where does the barrier if the judges ordered it, the governor as a state and the State Board of Education is in compliance, in agreement, and has put forth a plan, what is holding it up? Is it the funders? Is it the people who make the decisions about funding? A lot of our public just really can't seem, you know, really struggling with, when the judge tells me to pay my neighbor because I've done something wrong to their fence, I pay it. What's going on here? Why can't we have any way to make this judge's order happen?
Well, the judge hasn't entered an order yet on this plan, right? The order that he entered was for the plan to come forward. So some of that will depend on what happens next. But there is this question, and this is something that Judge Manning always wrestled with, is, you know, does the court have the authority to order the General Assembly to pay money? You know, are there constitutional issues related to the separation of powers? Like Elizabeth said, that's something other states have wrestled with and come to different resolutions on.
Mm-hmm.
But I think I think what everybody senses is that having the State Board of Ed, having the governor's office on board and committed to this, that some of this funding will be included in the governor's budget, right? Is a big step forward, and it does help that dynamic. So that's a question that, I mean, and that's where, again, this piece about the public pressure comes into play too, right? That's where, you know, if there are limits to the court's ability to hold the state accountable, and I don't think there's a clear answer to that question. I think we have one sense about it and others have other senses about it. But certainly the influence of the public engaging, and not just with the legislature, I think, but locally as well, like the stuff Elizabeth was talking about earlier, you know, that the school boards have a vested interest in seeing seeing the West Ed report recommendations be fulfilled. I mean, there's pressure to be applied. I mean, there's advocacy and, you know, civic engagement that can take place at all the levels. And that includes not just the school board, but your county commissioners, who are also have funding responsibilities. And that's what's going to be critical. I mean, I think that, and Elizabeth's point earlier about when we've talked to advocates in other states, they've told us that's been the most critical thing, is for the public to know this is what, and that's why this West Ed report is so valuable. Now we can pick this up and say, here's what we need. It's clear. This is what it's going to take. And so are you going to do it? Are you going to provide the resources that these experts and now the court has said we need? And if not, we're going to have to hold you accountable.
I think that's a really lovely way of segueing into, and to kind of, as we're nearing the end of our time together tonight, is that public education advocates can help. And one of the things that we've talked a lot about in this tonight is getting informed, getting engaged. And I really do invite you to please go to publicschoolsfirstnc.org and look under Leandro. We have an entire section on the Leandro case. We have all the reports, all the filings that have been done. The West Ed report is there, and a lot of information, because I think that this information is powerful. A lot of times in public advocacy, you advocate for basic things. Yes, teachers should get paid more. Teachers should have more control of their classrooms. There's a lot of things that the public can nod their head with and understand. But some of the ways that we go about improving the instructional climate, improving the effectiveness of teachers, improving the learning conditions and the climate and environment in the classroom and outside of the community to allow children to learn, is not as easily understood by folks like me, just people in the community. So the report is powerful. And when you read through there and look at all the data and all the information, and then very simple, these are the 7 things to do. And I thought it was, I have to say, remarkable on Judge Lee's part to say, while you're looking at all that, don't forget, I want you to have effective teachers who are diverse. I want you to have teacher assistants. I want you to take care of social emotional learning. And I want you to get kids started early in life on a path to good education. I thought that was pretty remarkable for a judge to have that clarity. So now we're entering, I do want to point out that Every Child North Carolina, I hope that Jen will put it again in the chat room. There is a parent and community advocacy group called everychildnorthcarolina.org, everychildnorthcarolina.org. I hope you'll go to their website also. It's a coalition of many, many organizations across the state that have kind of pulled together to say it is time to fund Leandro. We've had remarkable action by the court. We've had remarkable findings from West Ed. We've had a clear plan that's been timed out in terms of priorities and time and funding, and it's time to act now. So go to Public Schools First NC, go to everychildnc.org, and really get informed. And then I think, as you said, Mark, get engaged. We have seen during COVID and the things that have happened with ending school and starting schools, parents are powerful. Parents have made a lot of decisions happen in how we are reopening schools through their speaking up and standing up. Teachers have been very active in saying, this is what I need to be safe and healthy and do good instruction. So I think you're really right. I think that it's important for everyone to understand, grandparents, parents, guardians, business community, realtors, bankers, everyone to understand this interconnectivity to making sure that every child has a sound basic education and can participate in our economic and opportunities and can be a contributing member of society. I'd like to ask each of you, Mark and Elizabeth, if you just want to maybe have some closing statements on what all this work has meant to you. You've spent a lot of your career working for disadvantaged children, and how you feel about this, and how we can help you and Elizabeth in your advocacy as we look toward the fall. And then yes, the General Assembly will be coming in January to set a 2-year budget. So that will be a significant opportunity at the state level to do something financial. And I do really respect what you've said, Mark, about we also have to look to our county commissioners. They have, unfortunately, a burden to carry too sometimes because the state has not fulfilled it. But I'd love to hear your and Elizabeth's kind of closing comments on what this case really means, what your hope for it, what we can do to help you.
Well, I mean, I feel like there is a lot to be gained from connecting with advocates in other states that are confronting what really is a national problem. right? The privatization of public education, the undermining of the public good in public education is not just happening in North Carolina, it's happening all across the country. And, you know, Yvonne, you and Jen and others are just tireless advocates, right? We've known y'all for years and you've been doing this. You're committed. You know, there are, thank goodness, there are a lot of people like you, right, that are doing this across the country. And I think that where we have a movement for public education, the broader it is, the better it is. So, and then you don't need to reinvent the wheel too. I mean, a lot of, you know, what we learned about from clients of allies of ours across the country is that, you know, they've really got a system worked out for how they do this every legislative session. So I guess that would be my advantage. Mark has other.
Oh, that was a good one. I think, Elizabeth said something early on about, when we got back into the case and Judge Lee got appointed, that we, from Lawyers Committee and our perspective and the clients we represent, really put this case into a context that it really is sort of the next iteration of the same issues around, school segregation and the denial of equal educational opportunities that have affected the same group of students going back, students of color, low-wealth students. It really grows out of the idea of excluding those students and their families from the educational opportunities. And, we've always looked at Leandro through that prism, that it is a case about racial justice as much as it is about education justice, and the kind of issues around privatization and the withdrawing from the public space of education Elizabeth mentioned. Those issues are, just run through with issues of race and socioeconomic exclusion and discrimination. And so understanding that this case, and you said it well, Iman, this isn't a question about, one party wants to give X amount of money for education and one party wants to give Y. That's just the wrong way to look at this. And what WestEd has given us and what these other states have done that have given us is a model that says, this is what needs to get done. This is who's being hurt by failing to do this. And this is how we will measure and hold the state accountable. And that's why it's important to, for folks to know that stuff, to know what the WestEd report says, to know what the joint plan that was submitted says, and to continue to monitor it, because the context is there, and that's what we need to be pushing on every time we're pushing this.
And I'll just end before Jen closes us by saying, I really do believe that this is not and should not be a partisan issue. And I mean that sincerely. I belong to a political party and I'm proud of it, but it has nothing to do with my belief that every child that deserves a right to a sound basic education. And it makes so much sense, right? It is for the common good. When our Constitution was formed, and when we looked at the right for people to be able to have an education, it was considered as a way to make ourselves a strong country, a country where we could think and independently and make decisions and act independently and, earn a living, pay our taxes, contribute to society. That education was the foundation, the actual cornerstone of making us a great democratic country, right? A country that was free, and that all of our citizens had that freedom. So it really should not be a partisan issue. It's unfortunate that occasionally it feels that way, but I think the Leandro case can actually lift us out of that ditch, so to speak, and really get us to focus on what North Carolina has that's always made me really proud. That in 1840, the first public school in North Carolina opened. And it was very clear that it was open to anyone free of charge, and that it was a constitutional right in our Constitution. That's not in many state constitutions, Elizabeth. So we're really proud of it here in North Carolina. And I really do hope that this case and this judge has put us all back on track for saying that North Carolina, regardless of party, is going to be the state that once again goes back into the business of making sure that we take action to give our children a sound basic education. It benefits us all, right? It is so forth. So I do hope that all of you watching tonight learned a little bit. I'm excited about this hearing coming up in September. It's the next step in trying to move this case forward and to put things into action. I do hope that you'll talk to your county commissioners. I hope that you will talk to your friends and neighbors. I hope you will talk to people who care about this in the legal community, in the public education community, in the mental health community. There's almost no organization area in our state that doesn't care about this. DHHS cares about our children, how we're going to feed them and keep them safe, and how we're going to educate them. They care about pre-K. I mean, we can go all the way through state government, and this case touches some of their core missions. So thank y'all very much for helping us think through this, alerting us to September. So Mark and Elizabeth, keep us informed, because we want to be there listening in and seeing what we can do next to help you. And I do hope that everyone listening to this tonight and on a recorded version will really be paying attention in January when a General Assembly will convene. It will be primary job will be to set a 2-year budget for our state. And we need to be there demanding that funding Leandro is a part of that it's the top of the list. So I hope that we can all do that. So thank y'all very much for a great conversation. And Jen, I'll let you kind of close us out. I know that we've come to the end of our time.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Mark and Elizabeth. That was fantastic. I'm both an education advocate and a parent of 2 kids who are currently in public school and 1 who is in college. So this is incredibly important to me. Thank you, everyone who's tuned in tonight. We really appreciate you. Please connect with us on social to stay informed. If you visit our website, we have all of our newsletters. We publish a newsletter just about weekly, and we did an 8-part series on Leandro. We would love for you to check it out and sign up for our newsletter. So thank you again. I hope everyone has a wonderful evening.
Stay safe, everybody. Bye-bye. Good night.
Bye.